Welcome back to Crusade America, everyone. I'm your host, Sean Sainhart, and tonight we're diving back into a topic that the show has covered many times before. It is a problem that deserves our ongoing attention. I speak, of course, of the rise of right-wing extremism. It's a trend that's not just troubling, but also one that's escalating at an alarming pace. Let's take a look at the numbers. They paint a stark picture. Over the past decade, the frequency of terrorist attacks by the far-right perpetrators has skyrocketed. In fact, in just one short year, between 2016 and 2017, these episodes more than quadrupled. Remember the pipe bomb incidents and the harrowing attack on the Pittsburgh synagogue on October 27, 2018? These are not isolated events, but are rather symptoms of a growing and disturbing trend. Our federal and local agencies are at a crucial juncture where doubling down to counter the threat of domestic terrorism is not just a necessity, it's an outright imperative. And it's not only an American problem either. Europe, too, has seen a significant jump in far-right attacks, with a 43% increase between 2016 and 2017. Our countries face a mounting threat from right-wing terrorism. The primary concern? White supremacists and anti-government extremists. These groups, including militia factions and so-called sovereign citizens, are intent on launching attacks against various targets: governmental, racial, religious, and, of course, political. Take the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting by Robert Bowers and the arrest of Cesar Sayoc, who sent pipe bombs to prominent Democrats. Both perpetrators were far-right extremists. And while we can't ignore the threat from violent left-wing groups and individuals, it's evident that far-right networks are better armed and more extensive. We also can't overlook the ongoing threat from extremists inspired by the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. However, it's worth noting that since 2014, the number of attacks from far-right extremists has far surpassed those from Islamic extremists. In response to this rising tide of right-wing extremism, it's crucial for U.S. federal and local agencies to pivot some of their focus and intelligence resources towards infiltrating these far-right networks and preventing future attacks. And let me be very clear here. Terms like right-wing extremist and left-wing extremist are not about political parties like Republicans or Democrats. In fact, opinion polls show that the vast majority of Americans, regardless of political affiliation, vehemently oppose terrorist tactics. Right-wing terrorism often involves violence, or the threat of it, by entities aiming for racial, ethnic, or religious supremacy, opposition to government authority, or to end practices like abortion. As Bruce Hoffman notes, these extremists often criticize the democratic state for its liberal social welfare policies and tolerance of diverse opinions, alongside its allowance of immigrants and minorities in influential positions. While many of these attacks have been non-lethal or have caused very few deaths, some have been devastatingly deadly. In 2017, white supremacist Kenneth James Gleason was charged with killing Donald Smart, an African-American in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. In an even more lethal attack, Dylan Roof opened fire in Charleston Church in 2015, killing 9. And who, of course, can forget Timothy McVeigh's horrific Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, killing 168 and injuring over 680, driven by a belief in a UN-led conspiracy against American sovereignty. These events are not just statistics. They're stark reminders of the deadly consequences of unchecked extremism. As a nation, we must confront this growing threat with the seriousness and urgency it deserves. It's a conversation that we need to have, and action we need to take, perhaps now more than ever. Why is there a rise in far-right attacks? Well, several factors may have contributed to this growth, but today we're going to focus on just one: the ever-growing use and popularity of the internet. While perpetrators of domestic terror acts have typically been lone actors or small networks rather than large groups, the people who resort to these drastic actions are often the more radical members of sizable, similar-minded communities. Right-wing extremists are increasingly using social media to issue propaganda statements, coordinate training, including combat training, organize travel to attend protests and other events, raise funds, recruit members, and communicate with others. The internet and social media provide an unparalleled opportunity to reach a broader audience, which is why Islamic extremists have done the same. As one Islamic State defector noted, quote, the media people are more important than the soldiers. Their monthly income is higher. They have better cars. They have the power to encourage those inside to fight and the power to bring more recruits to the Islamic State, end quote. Right-wing networks have used the website formerly known as Twitter with hashtags such as nationalist and ultra-right in Twitter posts. They've posted videos on YouTube. They've established Facebook pages, created Instagram accounts, and communicated on social media sites like Gab and through voice over internet protocol applications like Discord. In addition, websites like the Daily Stormer remain influential among many neo-Nazi and white supremacy activists. One particularly chilling aspect of extremist online presence is their use of coded language and symbols. For example, white supremacist David Lane, a founding member of the group The Order, coined a cryptic term, the 14 words, also referred to as the 14 or 14 over 88. 14 refers to the number of words in the phrase, quote, we must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children, end quote, and similar variations. These slogans are rallying cries and encapsulate the deeply ingrained racist and supremacist ideologies of these groups. The internet has provided extremist groups with an echo chamber where their hateful ideologies are not just repeated, but amplified. It's a space where people with outlying ideas can find validation, support, and unfortunately, new recruits. This digital empowerment of right-wing extremism is a major factor in the rise of their real-world activities and attacks. So let's take a closer look at just one of these internet-fueled groups with some frankly bizarre beliefs. QAnon. Now, if you're like me, you've heard QAnon's name countless times, but you've only a vague idea of who they are and what they're all about. Personally, all I really knew about the followers of QAnon was that the group's perceptions of the world were distinctly off balance. Now that I've done some research into QAnon, I can say with full confidence that the group's perceptions of the world are completely, well, out of this world. Let's delve for a few minutes into the world of QAnon, a far-right conspiracy that emerged in 2017, rapidly evolving from obscure internet chatter to a movement with tangible real-world consequences. So picture this. There's a shadowy figure, known only as Q, who starts posting cryptic messages on the 4chan message board. These posts suggest a mind-boggling scenario. There is a global cabal of Satan-worshipping pedophiles, including political elites, celebrities, and deep state agents, controlling the world and running a child sex trafficking ring. This narrative, baseless and debunked, by the way, is the cornerstone of QAnon. Now, Q claims to be a high-level government insider, possessing a Q clearance, hinting at deep, dark secrets of the state. There's no evidence to support these claims, yet the allure of insider knowledge captivates many. As Q posts, or Q drops, as they're also known, continue, a complex web of conspiracy is spun, roping in various public officials and figures as villains in this fictitious saga. And just who is the central figure opposing this supposed cabal? Well, you guessed it, none other than former U.S. President Donald J. Trump. Portrayed as a savior in QAnon lore, Trump is believed by followers to be the key to dismantling this evil ring. It's a narrative without grounding, yet it finds a receptive audience. In today's digital landscape, where the line between fact and fiction increasingly blurs, the rise of QAnon stands as a stark reminder of the power of internet-fueled conspiracy theories. Critics, including politicians and experts, have been vocal. QAnon is the digital equivalent of a cult, says one analyst. Indeed, the devotion of its followers often mirrors cult-like behavior, with unwavering belief in unfounded claims. The reach of QAnon, though, is particularly alarming. A report from the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab highlights its expansive reach, with millions of interactions across social media platforms. Facebook alone, before its crackdown, had over 3 million individuals in QAnon groups and pages. Internationally, QAnon's ideology has seeped across borders, morphing and adapting to local contexts. It's a global issue transcending its American origins. According to a report by the Global Network on Extremism and Technology, also known as GNET, QAnon-related content has been identified in over 70 countries, with the most notable traffic from the UK, Germany, and Italy. A study by the Institute for Strategic Dialogue reported a 175% increase in QAnon-related posts in Europe during a 6-month period in 2020, marveling at the movement's ability to adapt to local context. An article in The Guardian observed, quote, QAnon's growth in Europe reflects broader anxieties and uncertainties, with a conspiracy acting as a vessel for various local grievances, end quote. But it's not just about the vast number of followers. QAnon's impact is palpably dangerous. QAnon poses a significant and multifaceted threat to the United States, particularly in terms of domestic terrorism and the potential for inciting violence. The FBI has labeled it a domestic terrorism threat, a rare distinction for a conspiracy theory. Instances of violence linked to QAnon are disturbingly real. In 2018, a man blocked traffic on the Hoover Dam Bridge with an armored vehicle, holding a sign referencing QAnon. He later pled guilty to making a terrorist threat. In 2020, a QAnon believer was charged with kidnapping her 2 children. The mother believed she was, quote, saving the world from monsters, end quote, a belief influenced by her adherence to QAnon theories. Again, in 2021, a man from California took his 2 small children across the border to Mexico, where he killed them with a spearfishing gun on the grounds that he had been, quote, enlightened by QAnon, an Illuminati conspiracy theorist. He believed that his wife had passed serpent DNA along to their offspring, and that his babies were a threat to America. Another man in Michigan was said by his daughter to have fallen down the QAnon rabbit hole before he launched an attack in his own household. He managed to shoot and kill his wife and the family dog before dying in a gunfire exchange with police. Several individuals involved in the Capitol riot on January 6, 2021 were identified as QAnon followers. The most notable among them was the so-called QAnon shaman, who became a symbol of the insurrection due to his distinctive outfit. And there have been multiple additional instances where QAnon believers have made threats against public officials. While QAnon's tangible impact has been minimal thus far, these incidents demonstrate the real-world consequences of QAnon's conspiracy theories and highlight the potential threat to public safety and order. The movement's evolving nature and its capacity to influence individuals to take extreme actions based on unfounded theories represents a significant challenge in the landscape of American domestic extremism. The logical question to ask about QAnon and similar fringe internet groups is how so many people can be attracted to consume and then be induced to believe so staunchly in unfounded and, quite frankly, ridiculous online claims. We won't speculate right now on how these conspiracies manage to blossom and flourish, because our guest today will be shining his knowledge about online susceptibility and manipulation. I will simply summarize by saying that QAnon's trajectory from a fringe internet conspiracy to a movement with serious real-world implications is a modern-day cautionary tale. As we continue this conversation, it's crucial to understand the role of online platforms in fueling the current rise in right-wing extremism. The internet is a digital battlefield that requires as much attention and strategy as a physical one. The fight against this tide of hate and violence needs to encompass the digital realms where these ideologies fester and spread. Continuing our deep dive on Q Save America, let's shift our focus to perhaps the most critical aspect of this discussion: combating the rise of far-right extremism. This is not just a matter of law enforcement or policy. It's a societal challenge that demands a multifaceted approach and a unified stand. Firstly, education plays a pivotal role in this fight. We need to invest in educational programs that promote critical thinking, empathy, and understanding of diverse cultures and histories. It's about creating an environment where hate and prejudice can't take root. Schools, university, and community centers should be safe spaces where inclusive values are nurtured and the dangers of extremist ideologies are openly discussed. We also need to tackle the online breeding grounds of extremism. This requires social media companies to take greater responsibility in monitoring and removing hate speech and extremist content with a keen awareness of the fine line between regulation and censorship. Freedom of speech is a cornerstone of our democracy, and upholding it is crucial, as we've discussed many times on this show, even when we find the views expressed to be abhorrent. The challenge lies in distinguishing between protected speech and speech that incites violence or hatred. But censorship alone is not the solution. We should also promote digital literacy, teaching people, especially our youth, to critically analyze and question the information they come across online. We must equip them with the skills to discern fact from propaganda and healthy discourse from hate speech. Moreover, there is a crucial need for counter narratives. We must amplify the voices that oppose hate and extremism, offering alternative perspectives that celebrate diversity and inclusivity. This can be done through media, art, or community initiatives, or even through individual conversations. It's about creating a louder, more compelling message than the ones extremists propagate. Another key aspect is addressing the underlying issues that often fuel extremism. This includes tackling inequality, social disenfranchisement, and economic disparities. When people feel heard and supported in their communities, they are less likely to turn to extremist ideologies. And let's not forget the power of rehabilitation and de-radicalization programs. These initiatives are crucial for individuals who have fallen into the trap of extremist ideologies. Through counseling, education, and support, we can help them integrate back into society with a new perspective. And last but not least, combating far-right extremism requires robust law enforcement and intelligence efforts. This means ensuring that our agencies have the resources and the mandate to monitor and infiltrate extremist groups effectively. But it's not just about surveillance and arrest. Law enforcement agencies need to work in close collaboration with communities, building trust and gathering intelligence in a way that respects civil liberties and fosters mutual respect. But why is all of this so important? Well, the rise of far-right extremism isn't just a threat to specific communities or individuals. It's a threat to the very fabric of our democratic society. It undermines our values of tolerance, equality, and justice. It creates a climate of fear and division, which can tear apart the societal bonds that we all rely upon. In conclusion, combating the rise of far-right extremism is a task that falls on all of us. Government agencies, tech companies, educators, community leaders, and every individual. It's about creating a society where hate has no place to hide, and where our shared values of diversity and inclusivity are not just upheld, but celebrated. Let's commit to making a difference for our future and the generations to come. Here on Q Save America, we will continue to explore and discuss these issues, because it's only through understanding, collaboration, and action that we can truly safeguard our society against the tide of extremism. Remember, it's not just the responsibility of the government or law enforcement. It's a task for each one of us. Whether it's through educating ourselves and others, engaging in constructive dialogue, or simply standing up against hate in our daily lives, we all have a role to play. Today's guest is Mike Trigg, a tech-savvy novelist with a particular insight into the phenomenon of toxic internet subculture. Mike's newest novel, available on April 16th, is titled Burner, and is billed as a fascinating thriller in which an online movement swallows up the person who started it. Mike is here with us today to discuss the dangers of unaccountable free speech and how we can protect ourselves from bad actors online. And that's the final word up front. My name is Sean Sainhart, and this is Could Save America. So we'll see you after the break. Welcome back. Again today, I apologize. I do have a bit of a cold. That was not the best monologue I've ever delivered. I'm a bit stuffed up and coughing, so please excuse that today. My guest today, Mike Trigg, has written a wonderful book that we're going to discuss, and we're also going to talk about the context behind the book, which is online extremism. Mike Trigg joins me right now.
Hi, Sean. Thanks for having me.
Hello, sir. Thank you for coming. So the book, I want to get to the...
You're so welcome. Your time has really
We're going to take a break real quick. Oh, no, we're good. Sorry. Something blared behind me.
All right.
It's one of those days, Mike. It's one of those
I
days.
I can relate.
So the book, I have to say, one of the things that really stood out was the way that you authored the book. And you really come at it from, let's see, 4 or 5 different narratives, really. You come through it from the perspective of Shane, Chloe,
Wayne.
Rain, thank you.
Yeah.
Wayne is quite a character. I love Wayne.
Everyone loves Wayne.
Yeah, he's a character. And you also, here, describe how you tell the story, because it's so unique the way that you do it. Go ahead, and it's hard for me to even explain, because it does come from different narratives, but it's also a chronological that happens over the course of just a couple of days.
Right. Yeah. The concept that I was going for when I initially drafted this book was what you refer to in kind of literary circles as found objects. So the idea is that these are little tidbits of information, not a conventional, first person or third person narrative. So my first draft of the book had a lot of that. These are things like newspaper articles or court transcripts or wiretaps from the FBI, whatever it might be. And after I read the first draft, I realized, okay, I need some narration in here too. Somebody has to tell me what the heck is going on. And so the primary narrators, first person present tense narrators, are Shane, who is the accused mastermind behind this anonymous online profile called Burner 911, and Chloe, who is the daughter of a tech billionaire and sort of an Instagram celebrity. And it alternates between the two of those. In the opening chapter, Shane has just been arrested at being suspected of being the person behind this plot that has kind of spiraled out of his control. And Chloe has actually just been abducted by the followers of this movement called Burnouts. What nobody knows is that the two of them are actually secretly a couple.
Right.
So it's sort of a jump right in medias res, as they say, into the action. And that was what I wanted to depict, was the unintended consequences of these movements when they get to the extremes. Obviously Shane has inadvertently jeopardized the woman he loves through his actions online and through this movement that he's inspired. And so I really like that story of unintended consequences.
Yeah, that was quite something, the way her abduction occurred.
Yeah.
And a good example of how he lost control of these burnouts.
Yep.
And that's something that we see in real life too.
Absolutely.
And that's, now Shane, I would say my interpretation was that Shane or the burnouts was kind of like QAnon in many respects.
Yeah. Yeah. Certainly inspired from that and other kind of anonymous movements like that.
The difference here, and when I was reading this, one thing bothered me, and I was like, Shane sounds an awful lot like a leftist in many regards. And of course, you got to that, you covered that aspect of it, of the story. So I can't bust your balls on that. That was terrific the way that came out. But I was like, this sounds a lot like left, because you deal with issues also like inequality, disenfranchisement, the millionaire class, if you will, against the worker class.
Yeah.
And all of that really fed into that conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you've got a right-wing movement attached to it as well. And it shows you kind of how these ideologies are not, they're more fluid than what we might imagine.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I was a history major, and I remember one of my history classes, the professor made the statement that at the extremes, the left wing and the right wing, communists, fascists, whatever you want to label those extremes of the spectrum, start to look and behave and act in similar ways, and I do think you mentioned in your opening, although this problem of online extremism has really been characterized, there are far more right-leaning
Right.
proponents of it than left-leaning, but there are left extremes as well. And so I think it's always important. And I tried to write the novel, showing both sides of that, kind of approaching it from sort of a centrist point of view. I think, and I think, even though my personal politics lean left, I do think one of the things that's been, lost or overlooked in, Trumpism and this whole sort of MAGA movement, if you will, is that economic disenfranchisement is a big, big part of it. Now, it is taken and it is manipulated and used, manifested in very negative ways, right? But if you look at the rise of fascism in history around the world, it typically starts with economic disenfranchisement.
Yes.
And the proponents of the movements that take power use that economic disenfranchisement as a core reason for spreading hate, spreading bigotry, blaming other people for why you're facing this economic disenfranchisement. But that's the part of that movement. And as the story progresses in Burner, you realize that even though Shane and Chloe are very different in their representation of their political beliefs, they have this common ground around wealth disparity, wealth stratification, economic, disenfranchisement, that, ends up sort of being the basis of their relationship and the basis that they sort of come together on.
Now, Shane uses income inequality to actually go after, he uses the structure, and this came from a real life story as well, where he was able to manipulate the stock market.
Yeah.
Can you kind of, I know very little about the stock market.
Yeah.
So can you kind of explain how that happened?
Absolutely. So Shane's rise, which is told through kind of retrospectively, you open up where he's just been arrested, but you get the backstory of how he's gotten to that point. I sometimes described him as like the Forest Gump of the internet generation. He kind of is this idiot savant a little bit, if you will, where he another thing that was sort of derived from extensive research is he starts as sort of a gamer. He's an online gamer, and he has followers who watch him play Call of Duty and other games. And that's where he sort of develops this addiction to the validation loop of like, hey, the more kind of extreme and outrageous stuff he says in this online gaming persona he creates, the more followers he gets, the more, validation he gets. And so that kind of puts him on this path of, extremist rhetoric that becomes more and more enticing for more and more followers who take it more and more different directions. But to your question about the stock manipulation scheme, Shane rides this roller coaster of sort of prosperity, almost, and almost sees himself as this Robin Hood type figure,
Right.
robbing from the rich, right? He extorts people through what he witnesses in his Uber as an Uber driver, in one scene. And the stock manipulation scheme that he devises is pulled straight from the GameStop short squeeze. And there's a couple instantiations of it in the book where he makes more and more money sort of in spite of himself by inspiring his followers to take action. And so I think everybody in the US stock market sort of stepped back and looked at that real world incident with GameStop shares. Just to briefly recap it. So what the dynamic was, many institutional investors and hedge funds had shorted GameStop's stock. All that really means is they've put a bet that the stock's going to go down, that the company may even go bankrupt, and that's how they make their money. They make their money with the stock going down rather than the stock going up. And this guy basically, started inspiring people through his, podcasts and video blogs and things like that, to buy GameStop. And these were all gamers themselves. And so they loved that message. They ended up through platforms like Reddit and others driving the stock price from, I think, $3 to over $300, bankrupting a couple of folks along the way. So it was really sort of a fascinating, I think one of the first really prominent examples of this sort of populist movement going into or being applied to a stock situation, a public market situation.
No, absolutely. And now, have we seen anything like that since?
I think that the markets themselves have become a little bit more savvy to it. So you can sort of view. I personally can view this a little bit both ways. I think when there are stock market frenzies, buying or selling, oftentimes the markets themselves will intervene and limit trading, right? And I think that buffer is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, you think of the price of a stock as being sort of a fixed thing. All it really is just showing you what people are willing to trade that stock at. There has to be both a buyer and a seller, right? And so I do think that market intervention can be a buffer to, things getting really out of control. We saw bank failures with Silicon Valley Bank, and First Republic had some similar troubles. So I don't think marketplace intervention is always a bad thing. However, when it happens, it really raises eyebrows, understandably. With this particular incident, Robinhood, which was the platform on which most of these traders were trading, intervened to slow trading. And, there was a lot of speculation about, well, who's got their finger on the scale in this marketplace to prevent there from being losses. So, I don't think it's a great thing when institutions go out of business. I think in general, like, we want to sort of hedge against that in our economy. But I also think, you can certainly see, cronyism and favoritism and other things coming into play when those market forces are tamped down. So I think there've been, there are thousands upon thousands of sites out there, Reddit forums, Yahoo forums, et cetera, that are, where public, individual investors can talk up or talk down a stock. That's always in and of itself a little bit of a gray area. I mean, how big of an investor do you need to be talking up or down a stock? But I haven't seen a major example of that since GameStop.
Now, in the book, talking about the GameStop, or in this case, it was also an internet company that he went after.
Yeah.
And I don't want to ruin anything that's in the book. It's there's so many questions that I wanted to ask you, because this book is absolutely fascinating. And I really got caught up in, as I was reading it, it felt like things were happening in real time almost.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, because that was a deliberate, tactic I tried to employ as the author. The book's written in present tense, and it does feel as if it's happening, right before you. That was what I was going for.
Yeah, it was a very hard book to put down, I have to tell you, because you want to know what's happening, you want to know what's going to happen next, and And I'll let the readers know that prospective readers that there's some surprise endings at the end of this book that you're going to have to just check out because they're really fantastic. And at the same time, I mean, I recognized incidents like in Burner, there's a terrorist attack in San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't focus a lot on that actual attack. This is everything in the book kind of happens. It kind of starts in the middle of that attack with the abduction of Chloe that takes place.
Yeah.
Was the inspiration for that January 6th by any chance?
Yes, it was. I mean, I, like you, like probably most listeners and most Americans, sort of watched that unfold in real time. And my jaw was agape. I worked on Capitol Hill early in my career.
Really?
I was a press secretary for a senator from Michigan, Democrat. And I was there when blanking on the poison they used, but they sent
the
poison.
anthrax.
Thank you. When the anthrax attacks happened, I was also there when the Oklahoma City bombings happened.
Oh, wow.
And so that was my first, kind of, oh my gosh, moment about how extreme some of these movements had become. At that time, this was still in the 90s, so the internet was nascent. Most of these were, still happening via radio and that rise of that whole, Rush Limbaugh and the right-wing radio movement. But it was a real eye opener and hit home personally, right? There was a federal building that had been attacked, and hundreds of innocent people, children in particular, were murdered that day. I mean, it was a truly, truly horrifying incident. And so, a lot of what I wanted to talk about in this book is when those things spiral out of your control. And I think we saw that on January 6th, right? I think if you had sort of asked people there, you could see this sort of normalization of it. There was the guy, you mentioned the guy with the horns, there was the guy carrying the podium out of the building as if this was a tour of the Capitol. I mean, and it was just so, I think I'm sure there were, I wasn't there physically. I'm sure there was a segment of people who probably came to their senses at that moment and thought, what in the world are we doing here?
Yeah.
But there was a set of people who gladly stormed the Capitol and put lives in danger. And in fact, lives were lost that day. So, I think that to me was another big theme I wanted to explore in this book is, the limits of irresponsible rhetoric, really. At what point do the people who are, stirring up the crowd and maybe not explicitly saying storm the Capitol,
right,
but that message is heard, that action is taken. It certainly was inciting violence, in my opinion, and I think people do need to be held accountable for that.
What, and that's one of the things in the book that I like Shane.
Yeah,
Shane's likable. He just was led down a faulty path in many respects. Well, in every respect, I guess. I mean, I say that because he does have a heart.
Absolutely.
I mean, he does have good intentions with all of this. It just, there's a few bad actors that take actions upon themselves, and unfortunately, it just sort of spirals out of everyone's control.
Absolutely. I mean, the phrase red pilling refers to this exact thing. The idea that somebody sort of comes to the internet with a blank, as a blank canvas. They see one thing, see another thing. Pretty soon, some algorithms feeding, more and more, of the conspiracy theorist playbook. And before you know it, they sort of have this radicalized belief system that they didn't sort of consciously set out to do. It sort of came about, again, as a byproduct of just viewing the next video and
Yeah.
reading the next post. And so I do think that, I think a lot of the things in this book, I hope, this is the optimist in me, will be sort of moment in time. I think that as the internet, exploded in popularity, and, especially some of these social media platforms exploded in popularity, I think there was kind of a naivety on both sides, almost a gullibility,
Yeah.
about the information that they were getting. I certainly have seen this. I worked for a major social media company, and I saw that on the other side, that it wasn't that they were trying to, incite a particular ideology. They're just trying to get more page views for the most part, right? I mean, they were there, and so the engineers wrote algorithms that said, hey, if you like this, you might like this. Feed you more, feed you more, feed you more. The more clicks, the more views, the more time on site, the more money we make. And so they were in a money optimization mode, these
Right.
social media sites, rather than a social responsibility mode. And they didn't account for the fact that money optimization mode was going to create this really pernicious cycle and radicalization for a certain segment of their users.
And what can we really do to even combat that? I mean, I know that's a very difficult question, but I mean, one of the things that you talked about is, and you said earlier, was normalizing, how these things get normalized.
Yeah.
And social media, the ecosystems that we have in place now, we're seeing the normalization. I mean, this whole QAnon thing, just it's almost a joke. The whole thing, if it weren't for the deadly ramifications that have come from it.
Yeah. I mean, I think it starts with, we all, as citizens and consumers, need to be thoughtful and aware of what we are consuming, right? It's very easy on either side of the political spectrum, any side of the political spectrum, to read self-validating information, right? It feels good to see something or read something and say, hey, this is what I believe. This shows I'm right. This shows I'm a good person. This shows. And so I really do encourage, I recognize that habit, that temptation, that dopamine hit is
Right.
a powerful thing. And so I think one of the, responsibility for that does begin a little bit with all of us, of really being thoughtful about, what am I reading? Am I hearing diverse points of view on a particular subject? That's always important. I think that there's one of the, I remember when Facebook released the news feed, as they call it, which is, the ability to sort of scroll and scroll and scroll and
endlessly,
keep you on site as long as possible. But the whole concept was that, rather than editors, selecting what you should read, you're going to read what your friends like. And that's going to be such a glorious world, because your friends will help sort of curate your information and the news that you get. Did not extrapolate that one forward to, all right, your microcosm becomes more and more concentrated. Your belief system potentially tips into more and more extreme, but it doesn't feel that way as you're sort of consuming it and reading it, right? It feels like more and more validation, more and more proof that what I believe, what I think
is right.
And, I think a lot of people, there's it's the QAnon movement obviously was fascinating. And again, I hope was a point in time thing, although, I suspect that movement will gain new steam as we get closer to the 2024 election. But it is a self-fulfilling loop. It becomes normalized. The belief system becomes normalized. The rhetoric becomes normalized. And there is that frightening moment that you outlined with several of the attacks you mentioned, where either because of mental health issues that individuals have, or just the radicalization that comes from consuming this content, it tips over into violence, and that may or may not have been the intent of the person who started talking about it. I think one of the things I feel like is really prevalent in online discourse today is trollism. I think a lot
Right.
of the right, and in fact, a lot of elected officials right now, they aren't really interested in governing. They're just sort of interested in being internet trolls. There's just kind of a desire to poke, to prod, to get
Yep.
a reaction, to own the libs in the rhetoric of this culture. And that's sort of taken the bait too. I mean, I think that there's a degree of not getting gaslit. I don't know how to put that in past tense, but that's the tactic, right? It's trying to
Yeah.
provoke a reaction from you. It's saying extreme things to get you worked up and to get you upset. And so I think that is something you can do too, is to sort of ignore that rhetoric. It's at some level, it's not to say it's not dangerous. It's not to say it shouldn't be combated, but it's also to recognize that a lot of it is just trying to get a rise.
No, absolutely. I still can't get how something like QAnon emerged. It seems like such a ludicrous proposition from the very start. This global net cabal of sadistic pedophiles.
Right.
I mean, and that Donald Trump is somehow the savior that's going to come in. And is that what it really is? Are people just looking for a savior in these things to some degree?
I think it's a combination of looking for blame. Look, who do we blame? Who do we blame? I think you see in these movements a large amount of, and this is again very prevalent in American culture at large, regardless of political spectrum, is victimism, right? I feel like I'm a victim. I feel like I have been aggrieved. And so grievance is core to what these movements are, right? It is someone's fault that, your life is not the way you hoped or planned or dreamed. And so I think it starts with that. And then I think you're right. I think that the movements that have a candidate that they're proposing or advocating for, it tends to imbue that person with this sort of, they're the vanquisher, they're the hero, they're the only one telling the truth, etc. What can make some of these online movements, again, on the both the right and the left, but what can make them so difficult to counteract is inherent to their rhetoric is this self-reinforcement, that anybody who sort of speaks out against the outline conspiracy must be in on the conspiracy, right? Like,
right.
There's always this convoluted proof loop that these movements sort of go through. The other thing that I think is really, engaging about QAnon, and I tried to write into the book in the Burnouts movement, is that the ability for the followers to sort of dissect what's going on. There's all this nomenclature. The QAnon posts tend to be very brief and very high level and very cryptic. And there are legions of followers with their own YouTube channels and podcasts and everything else who dissect these. There's, they look for clues. They pull out intended meanings and things like that. And so that's part of how the community gets engaged in these movements. And that I tried to show that in the book with the Burnouts movement. The adherents sort of take his posts, which, Shane, we don't really know, why is Shane doing this? He's kind of doing it to get a kick out of it for himself. He's doing it for his own social validation. He's doing it sometimes to get back at people that aren't very likable themselves, the heads of websites that he takes down, and wealthy hedge fund guys that he takes down. And so you kind of, I tried to write Shane as like, you don't really know what his agenda is. And to some degree, he doesn't even really have an agenda. I mean, his agenda is a little bit self-serving. It's a little bit of a mission. It's all these things. And I think that's pretty common in our current political landscape. Is it's really hard to tease apart, selfish actors from, righteous actors from self-righteous actors.
Well, and that's what I love about the character Shane, is that Shane is multidimensional, and again, he's likable. I liked him. I was kind of rooting for him at times. That might be a bad thing.
No. I
respects,
wanted you to root for Shane. This was another big theme in the book, and I'm actually working on a post about this, which is, back to that point about economic disenfranchisement, right? Like Shane's backstory, as it turns out,
it's horrible.
Yeah, his mom abandoned him. His father was killed. He grows up as a foster kid. He gets into a criminal organization, but he's, sort of that's his gateway into bigger and bigger crimes. But, at some level, he's doing what everybody does, which is trying to get ahead, trying to, survive, the best he can with the shitty hand. Excuse me. I know this.
Oh, no, you can go ahead.
Okay. All right. With the terrible hand he was been dealt. And so, I think there are many people who, tip into anti-rhetoric, who are just sort of trying to better themselves. And I do think I'd worry intensely as the father of two boys, there's sort of a generation of young males, especially, who feel, right or wrong, feel like they don't have the economic opportunities maybe that their parents did, grandparents did. There's, many people who are trying to exploit that sense of disenfranchisement to their own political goals that can lead to this sort of red pilling phenomenon. But at some level, this is what America was based on, is the American dream. And I think we've seen, the 2008 financial crisis is depicted in this book. There's other things where, gosh, if you grew up poor in the Central Valley, as Shane did, and, in trailer parks, you don't really feel like there is much of an American dream. You feel like you've been pretty damn exploited. And, there's merit to that. And I think left-leaning, Democratic-leaning politicians have been not as skilled. I mean, that used to be the Democrats' bread and butter, was blue-collar jobs, people, workers.
Sure did.
And I think that there hasn't been as good an answer to that group. And, that's something that, the Democratic Party is going to need to do a better job of addressing.
Well, absolutely. I mean, and, we saw the Democrats kind of shied away from the working class back during Clinton's presidency to some extent. And I think there is a lot of disenfranchisement. And it seems as though we just have a dysfunctional government. Everywhere you look, there's
sort of the brink
dysfunction.
Of shutdowns every month or so, it seems like.
Well, I mean, you look at the failure of regulatory agencies in our country.
Yeah.
You look at, I mean, on and on and on, we have all of these problems that are not being addressed. Yeah. And to be fair, it's one side of the aisle that seems to be most about just owning the libs, the Republicans. They do not seem interested in governing whatsoever.
Yeah. Yeah, I do think that is one of the most, disturbing trends of sort of the Trump movement. I'll broadly characterize it, is attack on institutions. That the courts are rigged, the elections are rigged, the Congress itself is rigged. I am a firm proponent and believer in democracy. I thought prior to 2016 that that was something both sides really could agree on. I still believe there are huge numbers of people, hopefully maybe the majority of people who are self-proclaimed Republicans who believe in democracy and believe in democratic institutions. But that's not what they're fed. That's not what Fox News likes to talk about. That's certainly not what Trump likes to talk about. That's certainly not what MAGA politicians like to talk about. They get, much more engagement, much more donations, much more, activation by talking about, burning it all down. And
Yes.
that to me is sort of the most frightening part of this, because when that starts to happen, you're in America, our institutions, if you're a constitutional, student, our institutions were created to be more powerful than the individuals, even the president of the United States. That is a foundational belief that I think has to be restored in America.
Well, to a certain degree, though, our institutions have been corrupted, have they not?
Well, that's an excellent question. I think that I guess I'll go back and talk about a time on Capitol Hill, maybe, to answer that. The vast majority of people that I met and knew as senators, representatives in Congress were good, smart, ethical, well-intentioned people. I think that a media cycle did start around that time. Not to say that we didn't ever, prior to that, think politicians were corrupt. We certainly did. But I think both sides have used vilification of the other side to incent their voters, right? Like, really what we've seen over that period of time, certainly Clinton, the Gore-Bush election, et cetera, is these margins of victory of 50.1 to 49.9, just incredibly narrow margins. And I think both parties realized, hey, rather than fighting for votes in the middle, we're better off trying to activate, disengaged voters and the extremes. Like, the number of people to be activated at the extreme is greater than the number of people to be swayed in the middle. And that's really what I think has led to our polarization. I think, again, both sides really want to paint the game as unfair because it serves that narrative. I think that, at some level, institutions are only as strong as the people that operate within them. I think that at the end of the day, it was encouraging to see, election officials do their job apart from party. I hope that will be the case in the courts of law, that juries won't be swayed by their own political persuasions, but they'll look at the facts. I'm not at a point where I would say that I think our institutions have been corrupted, and I hope I never will be.
Well, it just seems as though corporations have really taken a stronghold. And that's what I identified most with Shane, is this feeling that we have corporations that have infringed upon every aspect of our government, whether it's the election cycle, the corporate campaigns, contributions, regulatory agencies. We have this staggering inequality in this country. And It does seem like so many things are rigged against the average person.
Yeah, I think you really need to look at, this is another big topic in the book, which is what really is freedom of speech. The Citizens United ruling that, moneyed interests can basically have unlimited sway and unlimited with no accountability
at all. Yeah.
Hidden behind, shell companies or pseudo organizations, et cetera. I'll tell you again from personal experience. I worked in Washington, D.C. prior to working on the Capitol Hill. I worked in the sort of public affairs space, and that experience, frankly, kind of sickened me. I did see how much money was put into that, lobbying campaigns, how organizations, there are just so many. The playbook is limitless to setting up fake organizations to run agendas on political campaigns and political initiatives. Here in California, we have these ballot propositions that are always just sort of an eye roll for me, because they're always put on the ballot by some special interest group that is completely obfuscating, sort of what their underlying agenda is. So I think, they say the daylight is the best disinfectant. I think that I believe firmly in freedom of speech, but you gotta be honest about who it is speaking and what the money is going into those campaigns. I just don't buy this notion that, if I can't do it anonymously, I'm going to be targeted, I'm going to be attacked, sort of the arguments that are put forth for why they hide, wealthy interests hide behind some of these shell organizations. If there were one thing that I learned from my time on social media, it's that people behave much better when you know who they are, when their identity is known versus their identity is unknown. The most toxic environments on the internet are all done through anonymous profiles, where people feel like they can say or do anything they want with no repercussions, be out as outrageous as they want. And I think sort of the same thing happens with wealthy individuals. They sort of enact these organizations where they can apply money to move the needle and on policy issues or political issues that they favor, without any accountability, without the public having visibility that it's them, tipping the scales in the background.
Yeah, and I think that that's become more and more pervasive, and it divisive across the entire landscape of our country, whether it's on social media or. Now, you said something, and I just want to get your comment on this. You said something about the anonymous of the internet. Anonymity. I can't say that word.
Yeah.
Do you think then that everybody on social media should be required to be verified, to have ID verification?
I don't think you can. I don't think that's an enforceable thing, right? I mean, the reality is whatever laws we pass in the United States only apply to the United States.
Right.
I mean, you just move your web servers offshore, and Justice Department going to subpoena you out of, China or North Korea or whatever. I mean, so part of the fundamental challenge is that, there are no boundaries to these things. 4chan became 8chan, became 8kun, like it's hosted in the Philippines now. You can't really stomp that out. I think that, digital literacy, you touched on in your opening, I think is a very, very important way to solve this. I actually, on that front, I draw inspiration from my kids. Anytime I've coached them about privacy or anything else online, they are light years ahead of me already on it, and so I think that there is, as digital users, digital citizens, there's a lot less gullibility than there might have been, 10, 15 years ago, even just 4 years ago. So, I think those things are encouraging. I do think, however, that I would love to see this solution, as you described it, towards more honesty, trust, verification of who you are and what you're saying, be sort of affirmed positively rather than enforced negatively, if that makes sense. I think you'll see people navigate. In fact, I would say this of my experience in 2007, 8, 9, when I was in the social media space. The sites like MySpace that has had a culture of being predominantly anonymous ultimately kind of failed, and the sites that had established a culture of more truth in real names, real identities, Facebook, LinkedIn, were the ones that succeeded. And I attribute a major reason to that was that people didn't, they'd go into MySpace and they have a bunch of trolls just, gaslighting them. Like, why is this fun? It's not fun. And you certainly can see that behavior on Facebook and on LinkedIn even as well. But for the most part, those networks, those people need to stand by what they say, right?
Right.
They've been established. The cultures of those sites and the enforcement of those sites lean towards real identity, and I think that just drives a more authentic, more rewarding, more truthful conversation, more respectful conversation.
Well, on the flip side of that, we have this cancel culture that's happening as well.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's where a lot of people, I think, want to be anonymized, because people are afraid to say things that might be taken out of context or might be misconstrued, or even in the case, I mean, we're seeing a lot of interference now with employers that are monitoring what their employees say in their personal lives. And so I think that's kind of a benefit of being able to be anonymous on some of these sites in some respects too.
Yeah, and that's why I say I don't think you can outlaw anonymity on the internet, any more than you can outlaw it. I mean, I can go down to my downtown and people won't, know me or recognize me. There's sort of a degree of anonymity even in real life. But I find that, quote unquote cancel culture troubling as well. I think you look at that and you certainly can put labels on that behavior, intolerance, et cetera, that, is just as concerning and just as, negative, I think, on our discourse as what's happening on the right. And so I think, frankly, when that stuff happens, it feeds a perception on the right. Cancel culture is like a rally for the right, and so I do think there's a danger of hypocrisy if you're unwilling to listen to opposing thoughts and opposing points of view. Certainly you need to draw the line at true extremism. If someone's inciting violence, saying racist or sexist or homophobic things, that's not acceptable. But you also can't jump to that and assume that from a person who you really, if you step back, you just don't agree with what they say or like what they say. It's made harder to limit extreme speech if anything objectionable is sort of canceled out, right? And so,
absolutely,
you do see movements at universities, and I've been sort of the hotbeds of this recently, where you look at it and you say, "Gosh, you need to be careful that you don't overcorrect in sort of addressing some of this, rhetoric."
Going back to the book, going back to Shane for a minute, do you think that Shane could have turned out in any other way given the scenarios that he faced?
Well, so Shane's tragic flaw is he needs to be loved. I mean, that's
yes.
You realize his movement takes on different meaning for him at that moment. I just started watching, it's top of mind for me, The Last of Us, the series The Last of Us on HBO. And there's this great line that I think Nick Offerman, the actor, delivers when he's found a partner sort of that he trapped initially. He's a survivalist. And he said, "I wasn't scared until I met you." And, that is just a powerful line. It struck me as like, that's what Shane was feeling. Shane felt like the world was against him, that he didn't have any opportunity. And then he meets Chloe. And he realized his life gains purpose. His movement gains meaning, and he I don't want to ruin the trajectory of the story, but that meaning starts to morph for him. He starts to shed some of the more abhorrent beliefs and really focus on what actually is motivating him to create this movement. And the story becomes a little bit of a wrestling for who is going to take control of this movement. Just like QAnon, there's nobody quite knows who really is behind this burner 911 account. And so
And
You
that
know,
works against Shane throughout the novel too.
It does. It does. You know, he gets in a complete catch-22 about this, right? Because on the one hand, the power of this account is its anonymity. On the other hand, you know, he stands accused of being this person who's incited this violence, and yet, you know, to free
Facing
Chloe,
the death penalty.
facing the death penalty, yet to free his abducted girlfriend, you know, he's very tempted to post on behalf of this persona. And Wayne, his lawyer, who's the third narrator, turns out to be maybe not the most honest actor himself. And you know, that was the story of sort of exploitation that I think has happened on the right. You know, that where you look at these movements that are ostensibly populist, ostensibly working class and blue collar, but in fact, you know, it's sort of been puppeteered a little bit by wealthy individuals who've really, you know, buttered their own bread in terms of tax breaks and other kinds of things. And so I think that is incredibly misleading, manipulative, back to transparency of whose message you're talking about. But that was a really fun character for me to add was Wayne, because he's he ends up in the novel serving as sort of the intermediary between Shane in prison and Chloe in captivity. And you know, it's an examination of truth and belief and whom can you trust, and all those sort of questions that are meta questions in our culture right now.
Yeah, because Shane is literally just beside himself when he learns that he's been sort of betrayed by his own movement.
Correct. Yeah,
and that arc is fascinating.
Yeah, he didn't realize where it was going to go, you know. And there's a divergent point that you don't get to till later in the book, but there's sort of a divergent point where he's starting to fret over the more and more the people who abduct Chloe turn out to be part of a faction militia, and you know that wasn't what he was set out to do. You know, they've sort of, so he starts to worry about this thing he's created, but by then, you know, it's too late, man. It's already spun out of control. People have taken it different directions, and then of course all these factions within the movement start to do what happens in these. They start to theorize about, you know, oh, Shane's not really Burner. The real Burner is out there still. Right. He's going to rise up and lead this movement. And people are trying to, hack the account and take over as the leader. And, you know, all these things kind of spin way out of his control.
Well, right, because there's a huge amount of power in that account.
Yeah. And that's a large, you mentioned that you sort of like Shane. You know, what makes us like characters is we have sympathy for them, and we have sympathy for Shane out of the gate. He's lost this control of this movement that is his whole identity. He kind of gives a little soliloquy in there about like, how can I, where he's being asked by his lawyer, you know, you're going to plead guilty or plead innocent. And he's like, how can I, if by pleading innocent, he's saying he's not Burner 911. He views this right. as sort of the singular accomplishment of his life. And yet his whole freedom is predicated on declaring himself to not be part of that movement. The other thing that you may have found interesting about the narrative is his own guards in prison are followers of his movement. And so,
and some of the prisoners too.
Some of the prisoners too, exactly. So that becomes a whole nother complicated dynamic for him to manage. Is, you know, these guys become, in effect, the guards become his protector. They have a tattoo to show that they're part of his this burnouts movement. And so how does he manage that? They view Chloe, his girlfriend, as like the enemy. She can burn in hell, is kind of, one of them says at one point. And so his whole thing sort of crumbles. The other thing, of course, that makes him sympathetic is he's finally attained, the thing that he really wanted, which was love. And, his own actions are gonna threaten that. So
do you think that Shane is guilty of all of the crimes? Because that again, I got that sympathy for him, and it got beyond his control, right? Do you think it's fair to hold him accountable?
I think it's fair to hold him accountable. I tried to write the story with that as a question mark, though. I think that different readers, maybe depending on their own political persuasion, might see that question differently. He sort of doesn't really ever say or do anything that is an explicit incitement to violence, right?
Right.
And so I thought this was really, this is kind of at the core of the Trump January 6th stuff. What point is there culpability, right? At what point are you not responsible for the actions taken by people who are clearly driven to action by what you're saying and doing, And so I think that's really one of the that's always been, one of the stickiest issues in freedom of speech. The classic example of yelling fire in a crowded theater. I mean, that there are limits to what we can do and say, what we can say, what free speech is protected. I think those protections are appropriate and necessary. And, the current political and cultural environment is really showing us how important those things are.
Yeah. Which gets us to yesterday, Ron DeSantis stepped down, which effectively makes Trump the nominee at this point. I don't think that Haley can defeat him, and that brings back into focus what do you see? Because the QAnon movement is still got a very heavy impact. I mean, it's got a very intense presence even now. What are your concerns going into this new election, given what we know about Donald Trump, and given I'm fearful that January 6th was the tip of the iceberg, that we haven't even seen what's coming in terms of violent behavior.
It's certainly worrisome. I mean, I wrote a whole book about it. I mean, I kind of get back to the loss of belief in institutions. I think the way these court cases turn out will be an important decision, decisive factor in determining whether Trump gets the nomination. I share your assumption that he probably will at this point. Although I do think it'll be interesting to see, if all of DeSantis's supporters shift to Haley's camp, just how big, in other words, is the no Trump movement within the Republican Party. I don't think it's north of 50% though. So, I think that's a challenge. You see, I talked earlier in these online communities about sort of self-reinforcing rhetoric. That's Trump's superpower, right? Every complaint against him, every case against him, every civil and criminal suit is just further proof of the cabal conspiracy against him to try and keep him out of office. I mean, so many every day, there are gallons of ink are spent on, psychoanalyzing why Trump's supporters remain so
loyal,
unshakable.
Yeah,
that's why. Every objection to him is just further proof of the, old guard not wanting this movement, and so it becomes a really fiercely difficult thing. And sadly, it is not a non-previously seen pattern. This is how fascists rise to power. I mean, Mussolini, Hitler, you go on down the list, like they had widespread popular support, that believed in them very dogmatically. So I think that, and then, you just sort of, how do you combat that? I think that
Right.
usually the way a movement like this loses steam, and it's, I think, amazing to all of us that this moment hasn't happened yet, but is when people inside the movement really lose the belief, right? They start to really question what's happening, question what they've been supporting. Usually that requires something awful. January 6th apparently wasn't that moment for enough people to say, I can't be part of this. I have to say that there are many things about the traditional Republican platform that I personally agree with. I believe in smaller government. I believe in, reducing federal deficits. I believe in, not being, not overly taxing people, and many of those things have just been thrown out the window, right? There is, in effect, no Republican platform right now. I don't believe Trump even had one in 2020 or 2016.
Oh, absolutely not. Yeah.
Right. And so when anytime a movement reaches the point where it is just about the person, it is clearly a cult of personality, even though there are many sycophants and other politicians who, would be eager to grab those reins. I don't think any can. I think that this is Trump's party. And until something terrible happens, it will be Trump's party. What's been amazing to me is that, you look at like Liz Cheney and you think, here's somebody who is a conservative's conservative, the daughter of the Secretary of Defense, and the Vice President. You're like, what, and she's absolutely been hung out to dry, vilified,
Yeah.
by her own party for just having the integrity to run a congressional, investigation and say what she found. And when you see that, that's extremely concerning. That's extremely concerning.
How, in doing the research for the QAnon story, one of the things that I came across was a couple of people saying that it is almost impossible to deprogram people who have been indoctrinated to this level of intensity.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that? Do you think that's true?
I wouldn't say impossible, but it is challenging. There is this sort of trap of rhetoric that these movements do extremely well. There's a great book on my bookshelf over here. I can almost see it, called Cultish. I'm forgetting the name of the author just at the moment, but she does a great job of investigating cults and cult behavior and cult mindset. And to be clear, I'm not suggesting that, the entire Republican Party is a cult by any means.
Right.
But I do think that MAGAism, extreme Trumpism, QAnon, these exhibit exactly those behaviors of cults where, there's no challenging the authority. There's no questioning of the beliefs. Anybody who's critical of that movement is vilified immediately, is held up as part of the conspiracy against, the followers of these cults. And, the author of this book does a compelling job of sort of laying the foundation of, you see these rhetorical tactics over and over and over again in cult movements. And, be it the Branch Davidians or the Kool-Aid drinkers or oftentimes tragedy is sort of what breaks the illusion, breaks the belief that the followers have. And anything short of that, it can be very, very hard to break out of. There's something sort of inherently appealing. Again, I think we see it at mass scale in social networks in a much tamer way, but clickbait. How often do you go on to Google and Facebook and whatever, and you see stuff, you're like, oh, I like that, I'm going to read more about that, right? Like, we are just naturally programmed as human beings, our tribalism or whatever you want to call it, to sort of have that interest. I'll call it in a positive way. And then you can just go deeper and deeper down that path and really lose sight of, what it is you even really believe, apart from fealty to an individual, leader, or cult of personality.
Now, as someone with a background in technology, I have to ask you about artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
And how that plays playing, because we're seeing this kind of played out in mainstream media, across social media, I should say, as concerning with all of these bots and things that exist. How big a threat do you see AI as being?
Enormous, in short. I think that, well, first of all, I'm not one of those people who thinks, AI should be banned or that it's only negative things by any stretch. I think there's going to be far more positives to AI than negatives. However, the people who will exploit that technology to their gain, that AI is a perfect weapon in that battle. You think about, since the printing press and the radio and the television, the advent of all these new the internet, every technology has been exploited early in its existence to propagate propaganda. These are the tools of dictatorship, is the manipulation of a new form of media,
Right,
toward a political end. And I think you'll see bad actors try to exploit AI in the same way. It is a tool for scaling up. If you really back up and unpack sort of what are these negative influences that we've been talking about all throughout, it's really when a small segment of the population, even down to individuals, are able to manipulate a large segment of people to behave, act, vote, a certain way. The levers of those, email, robocallers, all those sort of things that have been out there at scale, misinformation, disinformation, etc. AI is going to rapidly accelerate the scale at which those kind of deceptive operations can move. Very easy to create, for anyone, not just a skilled, artist, to create deep fake videos and images that are fed
yeah,
right into these sites, unregulated sites that are predominantly oriented around image and video consumption. I worry about that a lot. I think there's going to be, I talked about sort of like with each of these things, and many of them I depict in the book. They happen the first time when the population is sort of still gullible, and then it's harder to reenact a second and third time, because we sort of like, you got it by me the first time, but
right.
I'm more savvy now. I think there's going to be an AI moment where there's just a massive fraud or misconception or that is perpetrated using AI, and I think that'll be the moment where sort of the mainstream population gets more savvy to the risks, and then hopefully that doesn't happen a second time. I just hope that isn't the 2024 election where it happens.
Do you think that's a possibility that AI will have an impact on the election?
It's having an impact on the election, indisputably. I think that you mentioned botnets. I mean, I thought it was fascinating where, Elon Musk, as he's taking over then Twitter before he renamed it X, and he's certainly showing how to destroy value at an incredible clip. But one of his big objections before closing the deal, trying to get a better price, was, there are too many fake accounts. There are tons and tons and tons of fake accounts. I mean, Twitter/X is, a very good example of what I described earlier, where there's not much real identity. There's a few verified users, but there's a lot of trollism on Twitter, and what percentage of those are fake accounts? I don't even think Twitter knows how many are fake accounts. So I think, yes, you see, like, that's how you feed these movements. You make it seem normal, and AI, chatbots, etc., make this normal. They make extreme points of view seem mainstream because, oh gosh, here's thousands of people who are saying this outrageous thing that I believe. You can just dial that to 11 with AI.
Now, Burner, I want to go back to the book. I love the book, by the way. I really enjoyed reading it. I think I read it in just a couple of days time because I couldn't put it down. I needed to find out what was happening. Now, this is your second book, correct?
Yeah. Yes.
Let's talk about your first book real quick. Tell us what that's about.
Yeah, so the first book is called Bitflip, Bitflip, which is kind of a geeky computer science term. You're probably familiar with bits of data. A bit can be a 0 or a 1.
Or 1.
And when that bit changes, it's called a bit flip. It goes from 0 to 1 or 1 to 0. And so I latched onto that title very early as a metaphor for a change of heart. And so the story is about, the story is really derived from my own personal experiences, 20 years as a founder, executive in Silicon Valley startups. And the protagonist, Sam, in that book is an executive at a tech company who kind of inadvertently discovers there might be fraudulent activity going on within the company. Which, to be clear, I never witnessed firsthand in any of the companies I was at. But I thought it made for an interesting storyline of like what to do. He's a senior exec. And so, on the one hand, he could sort of blow the whistle on this, but then, the 200 and some employees at the company are going to be out of jobs. So he sort of starts to right the ship and see if he can kind of steer things and clean up the ethical transgressions that have happened. And so the book really served for me as a, kind of a cultural critique of Silicon Valley and some of the excesses of tech culture, some of the conflicts of interest that I think can exist within tech startups that and venture-backed organizations that can, in the wrong circumstances, lead to really bad behavior. Theranos was a good example of that. FTX, an even more, alarming example of that, where, lack of oversight, unlimited money, a founder who sort of, loses their moral bearings. And there's this very fine line, any entrepreneur, any founder in tech can sort of tell you there's even a term for it, fake it till you make it. This notion that, you got to pitch what your startup's going to be in the future and not just the boring, unimpressive stuff that it's doing today. And I think sometimes founders can take that too far, or executives or venture investors involved in the company can take that too far, where they've lost a sense of the line between, putting a positive spin on something and outright fraud. So it was a really fun book to write. It again, it is not autobiographical, but it is based on many sort of experiences that I witnessed firsthand. And it's kind of, I always describe it as sort of in the vein of John Grisham's The Firm. It's kind of got this sort of like this insider who's just gotten entangled into this, corporate thriller kind of plot line.
Well, it was a pleasure to read Burner. I'll tell you that. So now I got to go check out Bitflip. Where are your books available so that our listeners can go and get them?
They're available everywhere. Obviously on Amazon. I always try to encourage people to buy through their local bookstores. If you look me up, they won't always have the book in inventory, but they'll have it on their website, so you can order it through your local bookstores. And it's kind of wherever books are sold, kind of thing. There's a ebook version of it, obviously, as well. And then after this interview, I gotta get back to the audiobook production. So there'll be an audiobook.
Wow.
Coming out in a couple months as well. So, I try to I consume a lot of audiobooks. So I made my Bitflip available by audiobook. So that's always a really fun moment because, you have the voice in your head of what these characters sound like and how
Sound
they
like.
act and the intonations and dialects and all this sort of stuff. And it's always fun, the people who narrate these audiobooks are gifted actors. The guy who did my first book, Carnegie Mellon, classically trained actor, and he does all the voices, and it's incredible to see them bring the book to life. So that's a really fun part of the process for me.
Well, Mike, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. I just want to give you some time to say if there's anything else that you'd like to say that we haven't covered, talk more about the book, and if we can put the book back up too for a minute.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you having me on. It was a really interesting discussion. In addition to the two books, I am a pretty active blogger, both on my own site as well as guest columnist on other sites. So you can find that stuff on my author website, which is miketrigg.com. I've written about, a bunch of the topics that we've covered today, from political extremism to AI and, kind of everything in between. So if you want to read more of my opinion pieces, that's where you should go.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure and again, I love the book. Please, please, please. I don't want to give people the wrong impression about the book either. It's not political in any respect. It's not anti-Republican, anti-Democrat, or pro. The book is really centered on the development of characters and a very believable arc. I recommend it highly. Go and get the book, Burner, then check out BitFlip. And the book is available right now, correct? Or is it it's available for pre-order?
Exactly. You got an advanced reader copy. It's on pre-order now. So you can get it on its release date, which is April 16th.
And when's the audiobook come out? Same day?
I don't have a release date on that yet. We're just starting production of that soon. I think with BitFlip, the release of the audiobook came about a month or two after the initial release. So kind of give a little boost to the sales at that point.
Well, I'm definitely going to get the audiobook of Burner.
Great.
I want to hear it again.
It's going to be a fun one to narrate. Yeah. So.
Yeah. Do you have the actors already for that?
We're in casting right now. And so, there's multiple voices for sure in that. So. Oh,
perfect. Mike, thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure.
My pleasure. Thanks for the great conversation, Sean.
And we'll see you next Tuesday.
All right.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.